Hi, everybody. Welcome to Theater Lovers Club, our October presentation with Santa Fe Playhouse. Thank you for coming tonight. We appreciate it. As you can see, we are doing a little hybrid. We have some folks at home and we have you guys in a live audience. So, and we are here fulfilling our mission of connecting you guys as audience members with what's going on in theater in Santa Fe by bringing you up close and personal with the directors, the producers, actors, tech. And tonight will be a perfect example of all of that. So tonight's event is devoted to 100 years of the Santa Fe Playhouse. And you're going to hear a really exciting presentation by two key people with the Playhouse that I will introduce in a minute. We're going to run for about 40 minutes, maybe 45 minutes, until 6:45, 10 of 7, and then we're going to break and take questions from you guys in the audience and from our folks on Zoom who will put it in the chat. So we'll have an opportunity to share whatever you might want to know that you haven't already found out. So I continue as a member of Theater Lovers Club Board of Directors to be amazed at the talent we have in this town. And I'm going to read you the bios of our two presenters tonight, and you will see what I'm talking about. Born and raised in New Mexico, Robyn Rikoon, she, her, earned her BFA in drama from the North Carolina School of the Arts. She then worked as a professional actor in television, film, and theater in New York City, Portland, Oregon, Minneapolis, and now New Mexico. In 2012, Robyn founded and ran an arts collective in Brooklyn, New York, where she created site-specific work based on Carl Jung's The Red Book. In 2015, she ventured around the world and studied in Southeast Asia, South America, and Mexico. After receiving the Keenan Fellowship for Directing at the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in September of 2017. Robyn worked as a director and actor in and around the nation's capital. Passionate about community and storytelling, Robyn is thrilled to be returning home to Santa Fe and serving at Santa Fe Playhouse. Favorite theater credits include Catherine in A View from the Bridge at the Guthrie, Christina in Red Light Winter at the Producers Club, Nina in The Seagull, and of course, The 39 Steps. Our second presenter is Kent Kirkpatrick. Trying to project with a couple people back there can't hear you. Okay, I'll talk louder. How's that? Should have been an actor instead of a fake one. Anyhow, Kent Kirkpatrick trained as an actor, receiving an MFA from the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. He taught acting and directing at several universities around the country before locating in Southern California, where he had an academic career teaching in the graduate schools of both the University of California, Irvine and San Diego. He moved to Santa Fe 2+ decades ago. In Santa Fe, he has worked in all aspects of theater, TV, and film and education, most recently teaching in the film school at Santa Fe University of Art and Design. He is currently president of the board of directors for Santa Fe Playhouse, which rounds out a complete experience of every aspect possible for making, producing, and running the theater. I present Robyn and Kent.
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, Theater Lovers Club, for doing this. I acknowledge this is a very strange experience to have a live audience to talk to and a Zoom audience there. So I'll try to work both sides of this and not be too distracted by all of it. So briefly, the Santa Fe Playhouse turns 100 years old next year in 2022. It's fascinating to me, this history. I love history. I love New Mexico history. I love Santa Fe history. And the theater history is just so cool. I've had such a good time. And the sources that I've used are the State Archives, the History Museum, the library, and also the photo archives. Also, the Santa Fe Playhouse, we have a collection of material ourselves, which we have back up in the loft, which I've gone through and organized and find little jewels every time I go through it. So what I'm going to present tonight is just sort of things that I have found that are most interesting, really before the last 20 years. I've been in Santa Fe for 26 years, so history is really before that, right? I'm not part of this history, although I realize as I do a lot of research on the Santa Fe New Mexican, I am part of this history. So I just want to start with a little context for what the world was like in 1919 when Mary Austin, actually she came in 1917, but in 1919, early man had been living here since 11,000 BC. The city of Santa Fe had been a European settlement for 321 years already at that time. New Mexico had been a state for only 6 years, becoming a state in 1912. World War I had just finished at the end of 1918, and the Spanish flu pandemic was ending. 1918, 1919, 550,000 Americans died during that pandemic, and 1/3 of the world population had been infected. Very interesting thing to me, Einstein's theory of relativity was confirmed in 1919. That old, I know. I thought it was really, a very modern thing. No, he started on it in 1907, and in 1919, they proved theory of relativity. And also in that year, the 18th Amendment went into effect in January, that it was prohibition. And the 19th Amendment was approved in June, giving women the right to vote. What's interesting, though, is even though the national government passed it in 1919, our local government in New Mexico didn't confirm it until 1920. So, whatever. So Mary Austin, next slide. Mary Austin was born in 1868. She was born in Illinois. She graduated from college in 1888, and her family promptly moved to California, where they homesteaded San Joaquin Valley. She married Stafford Wallace Austin in 1891 and became very active in Native American and environmental issues. So for the next 17 years, she studied the people of the Mojave Valley, and in 1903 published probably her most famous book, which was called The Land of Little Rain. And that is actually a tribute to the California deserts and sort of evokes the mysticism and spirituality of the region and of the people there. She and her husband were involved in the California water wars, when Los Angeles took the water from the Owens Valley. She and her husband were actively opposed to that and fought it tooth and nail. But when they lost it, they basically split up. Her husband moved to Death Valley and she moved to Carmel by the Sea. She remained married to Mr. Austin the rest of her life, although they never ever lived together. Her feminism took over and she became quite a strong lady. She did a lot of quite interesting things. In Carmel by the Sea, California, that was a thriving arts community at the time. She worked with, I can find the list of people there. Her friends were people like Jack London, George Sterling, Sinclair Lewis. And in Carmel by the Sea, she helped found a theater called Forest Theater. And she became a playwright. She wrote several plays. In 1911, she had a play called The Arrow Maker, produced in New York at, it was called the New Theater in New York City, The Arrow Maker. She also did that back in Carmel at the Forest Theater. And she wrote a play called Fire that was produced there. I found an interesting little thing that William Merritt Chase, the painter, had seen a production of her play, The Arrow Maker, at Forest Theater and called it dreary. So she left Carmel because it was becoming too crowded and too touristy, and she just couldn't stand it any longer. She came to Santa Fe. I'm not sure why. There's many opinions. She was either invited by Mabel Dodge Lujan, or she appreciated the Spanish and native cultures here, which is one of the things she was fascinated in the first place. Also just to get away from Carmel. So she arrived here in 1917, and by 1919, she had pulled together a group of people, and they became the Santa Fe Players. The first production was February 14th, 1919 at the St. Francis Auditorium. You can see photographs of that production in our lobby. One of the things that I find fascinating about that too is the St. Francis Auditorium was only 5 years old at the time. John Gaume, who created Santa Fe Style, was one of the actors in that play. And John Gaume actually was involved in the theater a lot. In fact, that entire arts community in early Santa Fe were deeply involved, and I'll throw out some of those names. But anyway, so she started the Santa Fe Players, and that was based on the Little Theater movement. The Little Theater movement in America was a reaction against the corporate or the commercial theater at the time. The commercial theater had taken over most of the venues in America, and they produced melodramas, sort of trite, crowd-pleasing pieces of theaters. They were making a lot of money. The Little Theater movement, which really was mostly active between 1912 and 1925, was a reaction against that. It was opposed to the commercialism, and they believed that theater could be used for the betterment of American society and for self-expression. It was a reaction against what the big companies had monopolized the theaters. And it was also inspired by the European avant-garde at the time. People like Chekhov, Ibsen, and directors Max Reinhardt and Gordon Craig. Some of the most well-known theaters of the Provincetown Playhouse, which still exists, was one of those theaters that was founded during this movement. And also in the US, the Washington Square Players in New York City, the Pasadena Playhouse, and the Chicago Little Theater. And I don't know why the Santa Fe Playhouse is not listed on this, but I'm going to change Wikipedia because we're part of that movement too. So 3 weeks before their first performance, January 25th, 1919, there's an article in the New Mexican, and I'll read this to you. Some members of the community theater, deeply interested in its success, were disturbed by the cheerful, not to say facetious manner in which the staff had set about the initial program. They hunted up the dramatic editor in her den in one of the chancel rooms of the St. Francis Auditorium to ask what she thought about it. Don't you think it ought to be more dignified? They anxiously inquired. Mrs. Austin laughed. Who ever heard of a dignified infant? The theater is only about 6 weeks old, you know. As a matter of fact, nothing could be more promising than the gaiety with which it sets out. One of the dangers of all young things is taking themselves too seriously. I am delighted to see this youngster to whom I seem to be elected godmother kick up its heels. You Santa Feans are a most amazing people, Mrs. Austin said. Here where I least expected it, where all the traditions are against it, I find the utmost modernity of spirit. Outside New York, I doubt if there is a community in the United States which could have gone at this business of the theater in a manner so identical with all that the phrase modern art movement implies. In all my 23 years of experience, I have seen nothing resembling it except the beginning of the Washington Square Players at New York. Next slide, Leslie. So you've seen this poster out front. This is the original poster for that production in 1919. I find it rather interesting that they were so modern and they were so forward-looking, and yet we use this old English lettering, which I don't quite understand what the reason for that is, but we'll let it stay as that. So the Santa Fe Players were officially incorporated in 1922. And then in 1938-39, changed the name to the Santa Fe Little Theater. 1954, changed the name once again to the Santa Fe Community Theater. Next slide, Leslie. And then in 1996-97, we became the Santa Fe Playhouse. We actually legally changed our name about 4 years ago with the IRS. So we are legally the Santa Fe Playhouse. And one interesting thing about that, the sign out front over the door in the late 90s was carved by our friend Argos McCallum. When he, everybody in the theater in this town has been through this place, you know. It's very interesting. It's all the names that I find, and everybody who's working, everyone I've ever known has been through here at some point. Argos was deeply involved in the Playhouse, and at that time he was on the board, so he made our sign out front. Now, in the early days, we didn't have a building. We didn't have this building until the 60s. So the players moved around town, some fascinating locations. Obviously, the Fine Arts Museum. Then there was a Rialto Theater at 117 Lincoln Avenue, just north of the Palace of the Governors. That was built in 1907, 1908 by the Elks Club as an opera house. And in the New Mexican, it's great. There's political conventions, boxing matches, theater, I mean, amazing things. It was sort of like in those days what we have at the Lensic, I think. Yeah. They brought all kinds of touring shows through there, used it for the community events. But it was a legitimate theater, and the players loved it. It was torn down February 12th, 1938, and there's a big article about how the Santa Fe players held a wake for the building because they didn't want to lose that building. But after that, many places across the street over here, the Laney building was at that time St. Michael's College. St. Michael's College had a theater building in which we performed over there. And next slide, please. Teatro Analco was used for a long time. This was an outdoor market. It was located opposite San Miguel Chapel on College Street. College Street is now Old Santa Fe Trail because St. Michael's College was right there. Just to the right of San Miguel Chapel was the college. So this was College Street. And this Barrio Analco, where we are now, Teatro Analco was, I think, either where Rio Chama is currently or where Garrett's Desert in the Sendero is now. So it was someplace right here. And this outdoor market had this outdoor stage that was used by the Little Theater at the time, Santa Fe Little Theater, for melodramas and all kinds of outdoor productions. I found a wonderful little quote in some of our material here by Dana Walling Jones, who was quite active in the 30s and 40s. And she said, "Life was simpler then. One day, 3 of us decided we needed one of the plaza benches for the current set. The benches were not fastened down, but not easily portable. So we were struggling. A member of the police force materialized and asked what we were doing. We told him. So he rounded up a few friendly bystanders who helped us drag the thing up College Street, and it went on the stage." Another fascinating location for me, and I'd love to have seen this. In the 1956 melodrama, the community theater performed at the Orchard Court Swimming Pool and Bar, which was at College and Alameda. So I think that this also is probably where Garrett's Desert Inn was. So they drained the swimming pool, they put the audience in the pool, and the actors performed around the outside, which is so modern, yeah, for 1956. Many other mentions of the old Methodist Church, the rodeo grounds, the gymnasium of the high school that's now the Sweeney Convention Center, many, many places where the players performed. And finally, in 1962, we got this building. Next slide, please. In 1962, in January, we signed a 10-year lease for this building. We paid $100 for 2 months advance rent. The community theater at that time made a special request to the city council to allow operations as a theater because this street was zoned residential. In this picture from left to right is Annabelle Haas, Bob Jerkins, Dorothy Best Donnelly, Joe Paul, Tom Donnelly. I'll talk to you more about Bob Jerkins after a while, but he's one of the original signers. So there were a lot of changes to this building. I know you've all heard the story that it was a livery stable originally. It was built 1896, became a bicycle repair shop, became a car repair studio, all kinds of different things. It was much lower, and there were, I've been told, pipes down the middle. There was a center aisle. So in the late 70s, early 80s, we actually got rid of those pipes and we raised the roof. So we could have the lights back there, Jesse. You see the diagonal old line back on the back wall? So that's when we were a livery stable. And we were doing theater in here with a ceiling that low. I heard a wonderful story from Carol McGiffin, who said before they raised the ceiling, one of the problems they had is they bought a ladder which would reach the ceiling over here on this side to hang lights. And one day, one of the technical people came in to hang the lights, and they saw the ladder down so it would fit on this side. But if it fits on this side, it's no good for this side. So it's really good they raised the ceiling to save on ladders. Right. The Fiesta melodrama is one aspect of this theater, which is one of the most unique, I feel. It's been part of the tradition since 1922. In 1922, the players did The Sorcerers of Nambe. In the early years, they used published melodramas and changed the names to make them local. Now, it wasn't until the 60s that we started writing them original scripts, although I have found mention that in 1937 was the first original script for melodrama, and it was called Nellie the Bandit's Sweetheart, or It Can't Happen in Burro Alley. I've also seen that title as Nellie the Bandit's Daughter, or It Can't Happen in Burro Alley. So daughter, sweetheart, Burro Alley, something in there that's quite interesting. Would love to find that script. During World War II, there were no melodramas, but since 1922, there have been. Part of what's fun about these, in addition to being written locally, is the titles. Next slide, please. This is the 1961 melodrama, The Peril of Pearly Gates, or The Plot to Purloin the Palace. Next slide. 1969 melodrama, The Cruel and Clandestine Conspiracy to Crush the Con-Con, or Why Does the Governor Keep a Loose Leaf Diary, or Will Success Spoil Ham Stargo? Sometimes these titles are the best things about the melodrama. Next slide, please. This is 1982. I'm sorry, this is 1976, the Centennial year. The Scurrilous Scheme to Scandalize the Centennial, or The Curious Case of the Contraband Coprolite, or The Burro Who Almost Came to Dinner. And next slide, please. This is 1982. Grim Gast's Ghastly Gambit to Gouge the Gullible, or Why They Gathered at the River, or Hocus Pocus Fashion Focus. And then lastly, next slide, please, 1996. Balthazar Buldozo's baneful blueprint to obliterate a baked but beloved burg by abusing the basin of its beauteous buttes. Or Girls May Make Passes at Boys with Big Axes. Or You'll Never Afford a House in This Town Again. Or We Are Family. This is you can see this is a production script, a picture of our former mayor, Debbie Jaramillo there. I'm sure she made a big appearance in this. These scripts we have almost all of them from 1961. I think we're missing one or two. And one of our goals for the Centennial year next year is to digitize all of those and put them online so they're available for study. And as part of our Centennial celebration, to make our history available to the world. That's sort of the first step of what, some of the plans we have. I feel that these things are very important from a sociological point of view, not necessarily theatrical, but to see what people are thinking in 1976 and 1996, and what is the comedy and what is the irony and what is the satire that this organization does to make fun of the community. One of the things I neglected to mention is that our fiesta melodrama is part of an ancient tradition. Greek comedy was invented basically as harvest festival celebrations. And our melodrama happens in the fiesta melodrama as part of the harvest festival. Greek comedy and also Roman comedy were also part of celebrations of the wine harvest, the great food, all of that. And as comedies, they made fun of themselves. So this is a tradition that goes back thousands and thousands of years. And I don't know whether we realized it or not when we started that, but when you examine it, it really is quite an interesting phenomenon, at least for me. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the people that have been involved here. As I mentioned, John Gaumim, Gustav and Jane Bauman. Gustav Bauman painted the very first sets. He was also active a lot in creating and painting sets. His wife directed a lot and performed a lot. John Sloan, the painter, Randall Davey, painter, Gerald Cassidy, painter, B.J.O. Norfelt. I should have examples of all these paintings because you would know as soon as you saw them who these guys are, even though you may not know the name. And Raymond Johnson. Next slide, please. So Witter Bynner. Witter Bynner was also deeply, deeply involved with the Playhouse. And he wrote a play called Cake, an Indulgence in 1926. And it was performed here at the Playhouse, I believe in 1929, or not here. It was probably performed at the El Rialto. And you can see that, next slide, please. He dedicated it to us. Now, this play is an interesting play. You really should read it. I have a PDF. If you'd like to read it, I'd love to share it with you. It's a very 1930s surrealistic, bizarre trip through something that is sort of hard to explain. But when I was doing the show with Leslie Harold Dillon, The Passions of Mabel Dodge Lujan, learned a lot about Mabel Dodge Lujan. And at one point we went up to the Mabel Dodge house in Taos, and one of the Dojents there told me the story of why Witter Bynner wrote Cake. Now, this is all hearsay, and it's rather gossipy, but I'm going to tell you the story. Witter Bynner was a very famous poet, and he did a lot of teaching around the country. He taught, I think, at Harvard. He taught on the West Coast. He did a lot of teaching, and he lived in Santa Fe. This was his home base. He also was very good at bringing young, attractive men back to Santa Fe with him to be his administrative assistants. This happened a couple of times. One of these young men that he brought back from the East Coast was a man named Spud Johnson. Now, Spud Johnson was his administrative assistant. He also was a budding poet and wanted to be a poet. And so he was part of this whole circle, met Mabel Dodge Lujan and Tody Lujan and D.H. Lawrence and all those people. Mabel sort of took a shine to Spud Johnson. And so she decided to take a trip to Mexico, and she took D.H. and Frida Lawrence and Spud Johnson. But not Witter Bynner. Next slide, please. So that's Witterbender there on the left and Mabel Lujan on the right. They were not great friends. In fact, they were probably competitors. When they got back from Mexico, Spud Johnson decided to move to Taos and be Mabel's administrative assistant. So Mabel not only stole his boyfriend, but his administrative assistant. So Witterbender was enraged, and he wrote this play, Cake, as a revenge play. It's about a very, very wealthy woman who goes around the world looking for the meaning of life, and she never finds it. So it's quite fun. It's quite fun. It was done by the players in the 20s. It was also done in 1982. Gene Moss, who still lives here now, directed a production of that here on this stage. Another person of sort of Santa Fe history is Dee Seton Barber. She was the daughter of Ernest Thompson Seton, who was one of the founders of the Boy Scouts of America. Used to be Seton Castle out on the south side of town until it burned down. I've heard stories of all kinds of theater parties and rehearsals and all kinds of things out at Seton Castle. But Dee Barber was very instrumental in keeping the tradition of the melodrama alive. In fact, she's written two pretty wonderful documents that we have in our collection, how to write the melodrama and how to direct the melodrama, which are pretty wonderful documents. Briefly, there was a wonderful lady in town. Next slide, please. Jinx Junkin. Jinx was another character that some of you may have known. I met her once when I first came to town. She was born in Chicago. Her father was a doctor, wanted her to go into medicine. She went into theater, joined the WACs in World War II, spent most of her time in World War II directing large-scale musicals. The people I've talked to here who knew her said she was the queen of the musicals. She loved to produce musicals. In 2000, she was named a Santa Fe Living Treasure. She must have been a great character. Must have been a great character. She also started a children's theater. Next slide. And ran that for a long time. Catherine Owens told me, yeah, the reason all those kids were always in straight lines. It's just like when she was in the military. She had quite a interesting life, I believe. One other person, next slide, please. In 1984, the Playhouse did A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, and one of the actors in that play was someone you might know from Breaking Bad. And a gun. Yeah. Next slide, please. In 2008. Next slide, Leslie. Number 19, yeah, that's it. Bob Jerkins passed away, the man in the blue there. And Bob Jerkins left his estate to us. Some of us were around when that happened. Yeah. That has been a lifesaver, especially in the last year and a half. Because of that money, we've been able to keep our employees employed, continue producing all the things that we've done. We honor him, and we want to build that back up. We've spent a lot of his original investment in us, but he was one of the original signers of this building. He cared enough to leave that money to us. So we really want to honor him and go to the next 200 years. Yeah. Next slide, please. Really briefly, some of the important people that have been on the stage here. This is a 1921 production of a play called Grumpy. It was directed by Mrs. Norfelt, and the man on the left there is B.J.O. Norfelt, famous painter. The man in the middle is Ashley Pond, who started the Los Alamos Boys Club before it became the place where Oppenheimer created the bomb. And also Clinton P. Anderson, who I don't know who he is, but he was a former United States Senator and Secretary of Agriculture. Big celebrities on stage there. Interesting, I found a blurb we did Our Town in July of 1939, which was the year after it was a Broadway hit. Directed by Mrs. Fergus Mira. Mrs. Fergus Mira was the daughter of a famed Shakespearean scholar and director and lived here. And I also found that Thornton Wilder spent a lot of time in New Mexico. He was, I think, a friend of the Playhouse. A wonderful little article in the 30s. Mrs. Gustav Bauman, Jane Bauman, was telling stories about the early days performing in the St. Francis Auditorium with very little sets, banners as for curtains. And she said the players turned out such performances that they had amassed $400 when the bank closed and they lost it all and had to start over. I assume that was the crash of 1929. They had built up $400, wealthy, and then the bank crash. She told of the movement for more realistic sets when the Nordfelts, the BJO Nordfelt and his wife moved to Santa Fe and joined the group, and how the sets were lost in a windstorm on La Bajada when the Santa Fe players were spreading their theatrical culture to Albuquerque and Clovis and other New Mexico cities. I love that. We had a show that we took on the road to Albuquerque and Clovis. I think that's good. Yeah, and lost the set on La Bajada. Right, right. And she also told of the first production in 1925 of a rising young Santa Fe playwright who wrote a play called Knives from Syria. His name was Lynn Riggs. Does anyone know that name? Well, you will. Because Witter Binner later told a story about Lynn Riggs. Witter Binner was on a cross-country tour lecturing. Gotta make this fast, but this is a great story. Next slide, please. This is Lynn Riggs. Witter Binner was doing a lecture tour. He was at the University of Oklahoma in Norman, Oklahoma. He was finishing up when a young 21-year-old student came up to him and asked to read his poetry. Binner was sick, but he also had to catch a train back to Oklahoma City to get back to New Mexico. He said he didn't have time. So the young man said, if I buy a round trip ticket to Oklahoma City, will you read the poems on the train? And Binner was moved by this. So of course he said, yes, he'd do it. He remembered that the poems were good and they were sonnets and mostly pretty good. So at Oklahoma City, they parted. The young man went back to Norman. Witter Binner came on to Santa Fe. At that time, he was living in a 2-room adobe on his property over here on Buena Vista Street, which is now the Inn of the Turquoise Bear. He bought it when it was a 2-room adobe, and he expanded it into a mansion before he died. But at that time, it was a 2-room adobe. One night, there was a knock at the door. He opened the door, and there was a young man standing there, Lynn Riggs, who had a suitcase in his hand, and he said, I quit school, I'm broke, can you put me up? So of course, Witter Binner said, yes, I'll do that. And then Lynn Riggs started telling him a strange tale. He said that for months he'd been unable to sleep, only taking cat naps, and more recently he'd had no sleep at all. But Witter Binner had seen him sleeping soundly, so he didn't know what this delusion was. He went to Dr. Frank Mira, who ran the Sunmount Sanatorium. And Dr. Mira said, okay, I will take him in. Riggs had tuberculosis. He was penniless and couldn't pay for anything, but Dr. Mira had read some of his poetry in the scripts. And even though he was penniless, the doctor said he needed help and that someday the boy would make good. So he did recover at Sunmount. And then Dr. Mira came back to Binner and said, okay, you got to get him out of here. We've done all we can for him. What he needs now is outdoor work, a way to make a living, and to keep writing. But he must write. It will be his salvation. So Witter Binner went to his friend, Mrs. Sarah McComb, who operated a large chicken farm where she lives at 65 East Alameda. Chicken farm at 65 East Alameda, imagine that. She took him in, she agreed to help. She built a caretaker's apartment over the chicken house. She paid him a nominal fee where he could take care of the flock and write. Witter-Benner later said it was a very cozy place, and he often visited Riggs there, and they discussed literature and the 1,000 things that were on the mind of rebellious young writers in the 20s. Riggs then moved back to New York City in 1926, and in 1930 had his first success. Next slide, please. Green Grow the Lilacs. And then a couple of years later, 1943, next slide, it became that. Yeah. So Lynn Riggs became successful. He did come back to Santa Fe. He paid Dr. Mira for the months that he was at the sanatorium and actually lived here for a while after that. So I've done some oral histories as well, and I asked the people that I interview, why has this place lasted so long? Why? Why theater? Why this theater in this weird town? Why? And I get several answers. I'd love to talk to you and get your opinions about that as well. I think it's starting to come a little bit clear to me. But one of the things I did find in this research was an op-ed piece that Gustav Bauman wrote. And this was published in the New Mexican in 1950. And in this, he said, staging a play is tremendously time-consuming job. Ask the players and the director. Should theater in Santa Fe aspire to Broadway standards, tailored to fit the tired and jaded city dweller chained to his or her dreary life experiences? Or should Santa Fe emphasize things just a little trifle beyond, in a place where hope still resides? A dead cat may be made to portray realism. Portraying it, however, does nothing to revive the cat. What does a good play consist of anyway? It consists of the same stuff that goes into a good book or picture or music, and that is the intangible something we want to remember as being worthwhile. It may be serious, uproariously funny, or in a thought-provoking mood. In an inspired play, it's possible to have all three with unexpected overtones that cannot be defined. The most rewarding thing I know is to make an effort for something just a little beyond reach, even though it hurts my hair doing so. And while not always profitable, it does keep me out of the swamp of unutterable boredom. The Little Theater Group has all the makings for doing the Little Theater Group has all the makings for doing things just a little beyond reach, and a competent director to guide it toward a desirable goal. I thought that's pretty great.
So it's time for questions and answers. We'll take questions from those of you here in the audience and our listeners at home. Let's start with Jennifer, who has a question.
Who wants to know if this is a continuously performing playhouse, what happened during World War II?
Kent knew this one was coming.
Yeah, the truth is there were no productions between 1941 and 1945. But the other truth is the organization didn't die. We stayed active, we stayed engaged. So when the war was over, started producing again. It was that during that time, the Santa Fe Little Theater. So they stayed in operation. But yeah, truthfully, yeah, there was nothing in World War II.
Okay, that answers that question. So does anybody here have a question?
Yeah, we have a hand back here. Actually, I'm hoping that you taped what you heard, because my partner would just love to have heard all this history with all the artists. Did you tape it?
It is recorded, yes.
It's recorded?
And we are hoping to put it on YouTube where we put all of our talks.
Fantastic. And I was president of the board of the theater in Boulder, Colorado.
Oh,
And got to save it. by raising the money for a sprinkler system, which is what closed it down. What's it about? 265 seats. And we had to have somebody who was going to make money. And I had seen Sylvia. And
Oh, great, great show.
it was what totally saved us. It's the comedy of all comedies. So, and I got to play the dog.
Well, it was done, I also have to be careful because so many great plays have been done. And I think Sylvia was done in
16.
2016, yeah. I mean, doesn't mean it can't,
It was our first show, and it was done here.
yep. Barbara
Came
Hatch.
Very close to setting an attendance rate.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
That is the show to make money.
Well,
And it's funny.
It did.
There was another hand up over here, a finger up.
Yes, sir.
I'm still trying to catch up. When I see community theater, which seems to be the heritage, that's usually, in my mind, people who are willing to volunteer at that. Is that still where we're at?
Thank you for asking that question. It's not,
Through the
oh, the question is Santa Fe community or the community theater to you. Can you tell me your name?
Drew Stewart.
Drew Stewart. Is that people come and volunteer their time. And that's absolutely right. And is that the same place that we're at today? And the answer is astoundingly no. I mean, we still need volunteers. I mean, the board is a group of people who volunteer their time. And we would not be where we are without the board. I'm very grateful to the board of the Playhouse. But we also are at a point now where we are paying actors a weekly rate. So, okay, so for the past 5 years, I think Vaughn got it from like $50 a person to $200. And now we're at from $200 to almost $900.
Wow.
So, and again, this is kind of like, we want to show people that there's a career in this, that this is, it's worth it to tell stories, right? We're not at equity level, but we are considered a professional theater, which means that we pay people, we contract people, all of our designers get paid, all of our actors, directors, everyone gets contracted and paid, a weekly stipend, and we're very proud of that. Very proud of that.
Do we have time for maybe one more question, either from the audience or from our Zoom audience? Jennifer?
I have another question here from the Zoom. Does the Playhouse have a relationship with the New Mexico School for the Arts? Or is there a apprenticeship program for students?
That's a great question.
Can
A
you
great,
repeat the question? Yeah,
oh,
somebody-
can you repeat it?
Oh, yes. Does the Playhouse have a relationship with New Mexico School for the Arts in some sort of apprentice program? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I consider that we do have a relationship with them. I mean, Barbara Hatch is a dear friend of both of ours. I actually, one of the shows that I really wanted to do this year was called, or next year is called John Proctor's The Villain. And the only reason we're not doing it is because Kimberly Bellflower, the playwright, got a world premiere of the play at Studio Theater. And so that show was pulled from regional and small professional theaters. But it's a play, that takes, it's all high school kids. And Barbara and I had extensive conversations about us doing an apprentice program, or like if they could come and do John Proctor for credit. And so it's definitely something that we want to explore. That's, another thing is people want to see themselves on stage. All ages, all races, all everything, right? And that's something we're working towards as well. So I would say we have a relationship with New Mexico School of the Arts, and we want to deepen it.
Terrific.
Yeah.
That's great.
This
Would you
has
agree?
been,
Yeah.
this has been amazing
Aw.
to have you guys here.